A little girl is standing at the entrance of a church in a town she has never been to before. She is somewhere between 14 and 17 years old. She is blind. She walks with a severe limp. Her spine curves sharply, leaving her hunched. She is small, even for a child her age, significantly smaller than anyone around her. Her parents brought her here on a pilgrimage. They had been told there was a miracle worker buried at this church, a holy man whose intercession has healed people. They came hoping their daughter would be healed. And unfortunately, she was not healed. So, her parents did what they had been wanting to do for years. They left. They walked out of that church, got on their horses, and rode away. And they did not take her with them. She stood there, blind, disabled, alone in a city she did not know, and listened to the sound of her parents leaving. That is where this story begins. And what she became in the years after that moment is one of the most unexpected things I have come across in building this show. Welcome to our porch. Hi, my name is John O'Connor. This is Everyday Saints. And if you are new here, welcome. Stick around, and if this connects with you, subscribe so you don't miss next week. We drop a new saint every Thursday. Every other week on this show, we tell the story of an unknown saint, someone history almost completely forgot. This is one of those weeks. And I want to warn you, the beginning of this story is genuinely hard to hear. But stay with me. Because where this story ends is something no one who knew the beginning could have predicted. Her name was Margaret of Castello. She was born in 1287. She died in 1320 at the age of 33. She was canonized, officially declared a saint by Pope Francis in 2021, over 700 years after her death. This is her story. We are starting in the year 1287. The castle of Matola, a fortified stone fortress in the rugged hill country of central Italy, near the border of what is now Umbria and Marche. Cold stone walls, the smell of wood smoke, and the sounds of soldiers. A military household run by a man named Parisio, a captain of some regional standing, who had recaptured this castle from an enemy and been given it as a reward. Parisio and his wife, Amelia, are expecting their first child, and Parisio has prepared celebrations, 2 feasts, one at the castle for the servants, one in the town for the dignitaries. He is expecting a son, an heir, a child who will carry the family name and standing forward into the next generation. The child is born a girl. Not only a girl, but a child with severe physical disabilities, blind, her spine curved sharply from birth, leaving her hunched and unable to walk normally, one leg shorter than the other, her growth significantly restricted. Everything that Parisio had imagined when he pictured his heir, strong, capable, impressive. This child was, in his eyes, the complete opposite. There were no feasts. Instead, Parisio and Amelia told people the child was sickly and unlikely to survive. They hid her. For the first years of her life, they kept her below stairs among the servants, not acknowledging her publicly as their own, not introducing her to guests, not allowing her existence to be known to the world beyond their household walls. And then, when she was about 6 years old, something happened that forced their hand. A guest at the castle nearly discovered her. The secret was about to become untenable. So, Parisio made a decision. He had a small cell, a single room barely larger than a closet, built adjacent to the chapel of the castle. Stone walls, a small opening through which food could be passed, and through which she could hear Mass being celebrated on the other side of the wall. And Margaret, 6 years old, blind, disabled, and the daughter of a man who could not bear to acknowledge she existed, was placed inside. The door was sealed. She would live in that cell for approximately a decade. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Not the physical conditions, though those are hard enough. The psychological reality of it. A child growing up knowing that the people who were supposed to love her most had decided her existence was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be raised. That her value, in their eyes, was so low that the solution was simply to make her invisible. What that does to a child, what it would do to almost any child, is obvious. You would expect bitterness, rage, a deep and permanent wound that shaped everything about who you became. That is not what happened to Margaret. Her father's chaplain visited her frequently, instructed her in the faith, brought her the sacraments. And in that small stone cell, with nothing but time and silence and prayer, Margaret built an interior life of extraordinary depth. She memorized prayers. She meditated for hours. She developed what her later biographers described as a profound and unshakable sense of being loved, not by her parents, who had made their feelings clear, but by God, who apparently had not. She came out of that cell years later, not broken, but radiant. Eventually, the castle became militarily unsafe. The threat of invasion meant the family needed to move, and this created a logistical problem for Parisio. He could no longer simply keep Margaret sealed away in a cell adjacent to his chapel. He had to do something with her. What he chose to do reveals exactly who he was. He had heard about a Franciscan shrine in the city of Castello where a holy man was buried, whose intercession had reportedly produced miracles. Parisio and Amelia decided to take Margaret on a pilgrimage to this shrine. Not out of devotion, no, but out of calculation. If she could be healed, if God would simply fix her, then the problem would be solved. She would become the heir they had always wanted, or at least someone they could acknowledge without shame. Now picture the journey, a family traveling to a holy site, bringing their disabled daughter they had hidden from the world for a decade, hoping that at the end of the road, she would become someone different, someone they could love. They arrived at the church of San Francesco in Castello. They prayed. They placed Margaret before the shrine. They waited. Nothing happened. No vision, no healing, no miracle. Just a blind girl with a curved spine standing in a church exactly as she had arrived. And in that moment, standing before the tomb of a holy man who had not healed their daughter, Parisio and Amelia made the decision they had apparently been building toward for years. They left. They simply walked out of the church, mounted their horses, and rode away. Without her. Without a word of explanation. Without making any arrangement for her care or her survival. They abandoned their disabled, blind teenage daughter in a city she had never been to, among people she did not know, with no money, no shelter, and no idea what just happened. The historical record does not tell us what Margaret felt in that moment. She never recorded it. Her later biographers describe her as having accepted it with peace. I find that hard to fully believe, and also, somehow, completely consistent with who she was becoming. What the record does tell us is what happened next. The people of Castello found her. Not the wealthy people, not the powerful people, not the kind of people who could have offered her comfort and ease and a soft place to land. The poor people, the beggars, the people who slept in doorways and knew what it meant to be discarded by a world that had decided they didn't count. They recognized something in her immediately, and they took her in. She learned to beg. She slept in doorways and empty buildings. She moved through the streets of Castello with a walking stick, blind and hunched and small, entirely dependent on the charity of people who had almost nothing themselves. And here's the thing the record keeps returning to, the thing that every person who has encountered her in those early years in Castello mentioned when they later described her. She was joyful, not performing joy, not the brittle cheerfulness of someone who had decided that optimism is a survival strategy. Genuine, deep, inexplicable joy, the kind that made people stop and stare, because it did not fit. It did not make sense. A girl abandoned by her parents, begging in the streets, blind and disabled and without a single material comfort. And she was the most at peace person most of them had ever encountered. People began seeking her out, not to help her, to be near her, to talk to her, to ask her for her prayers. Word spread through Castello the way word spreads in a small city when something unusual is happening, quietly, persistently, and from neighbor to neighbor. Eventually, a group of nuns offered her a place to live. She moved into their convent, and almost immediately, to the nuns' great credit in recognizing it, even if they couldn't handle it, they realized she was more devout than they were, more disciplined, more serious about prayer and fasting and the interior life than the community the nuns had built. It made them uncomfortable. Eventually, the nuns asked her to leave, and she left without complaint. She went back to the streets. The poor people of Castello took her in again, this time more permanently, rotating her between their homes. A community of people who had nothing were taking care of someone who also had nothing, and finding out in the process that she was giving them far more than they were giving her. She eventually joined the Dominicans, not as a nun living in a convent, but as a lay member. So think of it like this: being part of a team without being on the full-time roster. She followed their way of life, their prayer schedule, their rule, but she lived out in the world among the people of Castello. She went to Mass daily. She went to confession daily. She prayed for hours. She visited prisoners in the city jail, sitting with people in darkness because darkness held no terror for someone who had never seen light. She was, by every account that survives, one of the most genuinely happy people anyone in Castello had ever met. Margaret died on April 13th in the year 1320. She was 33 years old. She had been ill for some time. Her body, which had never been strong, finally gave out. She received the last sacraments. Dominican friars chanted psalms in procession outside her door. And she died, according to the accounts of those present, in complete serenity. No fear, no bitterness, no last-minute reckoning with everything that had been done to her. Just peace. The same peace she had carried her entire life. And then, the city of Castello did something extraordinary. When word spread that Margaret had died, the townspeople, the ordinary, poor, working people of Castello, flooded into the streets. They came to her funeral in such numbers that the parish priest, who had not been particularly attentive to her during her life, tried to have her buried in a simple grave outside the church. The crowd refused. They demanded she be buried inside, with honor, in a place where they could come to pray. The priest, well, he resisted. But at the funeral, in front of the crowd, a disabled girl was miraculously healed. He immediately allowed the burial inside. When her body was examined years later, two remarkable things were documented and recorded by the local bishop. Her remains were incorrupt, preserved, decades after her death, without the decay that should have occurred. And inside her heart, when it was examined, 3 small pearl-like stones were found, on which appeared to be carved images that witnesses described as religious figures. The Greek root of Margaret, margaron, means pearl. So, Margaret means pearl. And a kind maid, if you think back to the beginning of the story, had given her that name at birth, when her parents could not bring themselves to name her. She was finally canonized by Pope Francis in April of 2021, 700 years after her death. Her incorrupt body still lies under the main altar of St. Dominic's Church in Castello. People still come to pray there. All right, back on the porch. I have been sitting on Margaret's story for quite a bit now, and the one thing I keep returning to is the joy. Not the abandonment, as devastating as that is. Not the miracles, as remarkable as those are. The joy. The specific, documented, inexplicable joy of a woman who had been given every possible reason to be bitter and wasn't. Because here's what I notice. Margaret did not achieve joy in spite of what was done to her. She achieved it in the middle of it, in a sealed cell, on the streets of Castello, in a convent that asked her to leave, in a city of strangers who had become, through no design of her own, her family. She did not wait for her circumstances to improve before she allowed herself to be at peace. She found peace inside the circumstances. And I think that is the harder and more useful thing. Because most of us are waiting for something to change before we let ourselves be okay. We are waiting for the relationship to work out, for the career to stabilize, for the family situation to resolve, for the wound from the person who was supposed to love us and didn't, the parent, the partner, the friend, to stop hurting before we allow ourselves to move forward. Margaret had a wound that never healed in the conventional sense. Her parents never came back. There was never any reconciliation scene, no letter of apology, no moment where Parisio and Amelia appeared at the gates of Castello and said, "Hey, I was wrong." As far as the historical record shows, they simply disappeared from her life the day they rode away from that church. And she built something extraordinary anyway. In a city of strangers. With a body that never worked the way bodies are supposed to work. With nothing. No money, no family, no status, no advantages of any kind. She built joy from the inside out. In the only place that joy can actually be built. So, the practical challenge this week is this. Find 10 quiet minutes in the car, before bed, wherever works for you. And ask yourself one honest question. What condition have I placed on my own peace? Not a rhetorical question, a real one. Write it down if that helps. Say it out loud if nobody's listening. What is the thing you are waiting on before you allow yourself to be fully okay? when the relationship heals, when the career stabilizes, when the person who hurt me finally says they're sorry, when my circumstances look different than they do right now. Name it specifically. Not things need to get better. No. What specifically needs to get better before you give yourself permission to be at peace? Margaret's answer to that question was nothing. There was no condition. Her parents never came back. Her body never healed. The nuns never apologized. And she built something extraordinary anyway, from the inside out. Again, in the only place it can be built. You don't have to have her answer yet. Just be honest about what yours currently is. That's the whole challenge. Just name it. And now it is time for the closing prayer. Lord, thank you for Margaret. Thank you for a girl born into a family that could not see her worth, and who found, in a sealed cell with nothing but silence and your presence, something so solid that no amount of rejection could shake it. For everyone listening who has been made to feel like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved, remind them of Margaret. Remind them that the people who failed to see their value were simply wrong. That worth is not assigned by parents or circumstances or the world's judgment of what is useful and impressive. And for anyone carrying a bitterness they feel completely entitled to, because what has been done to them was genuinely wrong, give them just a glimpse of what Margaret found on the other side of it. Not to minimize the wound, no, just to show them what is possible. We love you, even when the people who were supposed to show us what love looks like didn't. Amen. One more thing before we go. Margaret of Castello is the patron saint of the unwanted, the disabled, the blind, the abandoned, the homeless, and people rejected by religious orders. Now, that last one is a specific nod to the nuns who asked her to leave their convent. She was canonized in 2021, making her one of the newest saints in the Catholic Church, though her beatification happened all the way back in 1609. Beatification is the official church declaration that a deceased person is in heaven and can be publicly venerated as blessed. It took 400 more years for the formal canonization. Some things just move slowly. Her feast day is April 13th, the day she died. Her incorrupt body is still in Castello, in St. Dominic's Church, under the main altar. If you ever find yourself in that part of Umbria, and you should, it is extraordinarily beautiful countryside. She is worth visiting. The girl her parents named Pearl, but could not yet see the value of, is still there, still drawing people in, 700 years later. That is episode 8 of Everyday Saints. If Margaret's story moves you, share it. One person. Someone who might need to hear that the people who failed to see their worth were simply wrong about them. Leave a review if you have a minute. It genuinely helps more people find the show. Next week, we go back to a known saint, one of the most dramatic stories in the entire New Testament. A man who didn't just drift from faith. He actively hunted down the people who had it, and then had the most sudden, complete, and world-changing reversal of direction in the history of the early church. I'm John O'Connor. Thanks for sitting on our porch with us, and I will see you next week.